Let me begin by saying a few basic things about economics, just so we're all on the same page, and because since I do a lot of speaking around the country, I have come to learn the bitter lesson that whatever passes for economics education in the United States is right up there with education in nuclear physics. In other words, there isn't much, and most people don't get it. And so they turn away from economics, a little bit like people turn away from mathematics and subjects like that, that are basically presented so badly that the student feels it's his or her fault and doesn't want to go there. So I'm not saying that happened to any of you, but it might have. And it might be helpful if we all started on the same page with some basic economics. Okay. So bear with me, this is simple, but it is more important to get it clear than you might imagine. Human beings are a little different from most other creatures on this planet because instead of simply looking and hoping to find what sustains us, food, shelter, so on, we make it. We are human beings who use our brains and muscles to shape, to control our environment, and to take care of ourselves. And to make a long story short, we work. We use our brains and muscles to transform the things we find in nature, to put them in a new and different form that pleases us, that satisfies us. We take a tree and we make a table. We take a cotton plant and we make a shirt, and so on. And human beings, for as long as we have a human record, have been doing that. They have been working to produce goods and services out of nature to satisfy and take care of themselves. What has happened over the history of the human race is how we've organized that. We've done that very differently. For example, for much of the history of the human race, human beings did this individually or in very small groups. A family. That is, we went to work as individuals or very small groups, used our brains and muscles to produce the goods and services we consumed. We grew the vegetables. We cared for the animals. We found a way to get clothing by taking the fur of an animal, and so on. We built a little house, a shack, a lean-to, whatever. And that was true for tens of thousands of years of human life. Individual, small groups, and even if they clump together in something bigger, each of the little groups within the something bigger functioned this way. Then at a certain point in human history, something monumental happened. Many reasons, and we call that nowadays a division of labor. It stopped being the case that everybody produced all of what he or she needed. We began to specialize. It's what we all take for granted now. This one becomes the baker of the bread. This one becomes the spinner of the wool. This one becomes the builder of the house. This one becomes the school teacher. You know the rest of it. And that's fine. We specialize, all kinds of reasons. But what I want to focus you on is that when we specialize, we have a new problem, which we didn't have when we didn't specialize as human beings. Because if you don't specialize, if each of us produces pretty much what us, myself, my little family, my little group, if we produce what we consume, we don't have to worry about something economists call distribution. But if I produce only one thing and you produce something else and she produces still something else, then we have to come up with a way of distributing what each of us produces to one another, or else I'll be great at making ladders, but I'll die tomorrow because I have no food. You will have a lot of food, but you won't be able to get up the tree to harvest the apples above what you can reach because you don't have a ladder. So there has to be a distribution system, some way to parcel out amongst all of us what we each specialize in producing. And the human race has been very creative in how to do that. What lasted most in human history was a kind of ritual of doing that. It became a kind of social ritual, maybe a religious ritual. For example, terms like harvest is when we gather the fruits of our different labors. You get the corn, you get the eggs, you get the meat, whatever it is. And then we have a festival. All cultures have harvest festivals where they distribute, where we work out, I'm going to give you the eggs that I don't need myself, and you're going to give me the carrots that you don't need, and you the wheat, and you the rice, and all the rest of it. Other systems were also developed. A group of elders, that's very popular in human history, older people who've lived around a long time and kind of know what's going on, they get together and they parcel out amongst all of us what each of us specializes in producing. And so we get the distribution that way. Sometimes it isn't an elder, it's just a kind of rule, a custom that develops. For example, in your family, when you do a certain kind of labor, say around a Thanksgiving Day table, and you variously do things. Maybe your mother prepares the turkey and you do the mashed potatoes and your brother does the cranberry sauce or whatever. And then the question is, each of you has made something, but your Thanksgiving is not going to see you groveling in the cranberry sauce as your activity. You'd like some turkey and you'd like some potatoes. And so a method works out. Maybe the method is grandma hands it out. Maybe your father does it. Very interesting how it gets worked out, family by family, who's in the position of deciding. And you remember when you were a kid, you had a problem. You wanted 2 chocolate puddings at the end of the meal, and that became a tension as to who would get the extra dessert. You, your cousin, your uncle, grandma, grandpa, whoever. That has to be worked out. That is a distributional problem. Okay? Then, a few 100 years ago, we began to do this distribution in a very peculiar way. It had happened before, but it had been sporadic. But starting about 300-400 years ago, 500 years ago, depending on when you count, in the western part of the world, Europe and so on, a development happened that organized a new way of distributing the goods that were specially made by different people. And that way was called the market. The market is a peculiar arrangement. Here's how it works. You make a bunch of stuff, bread or shirts or whatever, and you come to a particular place at a particular time, the edge of the village at 5 o'clock on Thursdays, and you open a little blanket and you lay out the stuff you've done, the eggs you have, the chicken, the shirts, the whatever. And along come people who likewise came to market with whatever they made, baskets or chairs or whatever, and a peculiar ritual develops in which you and the other person bargain, a new word. I'll give you 4 of my shirts if you give me 6 loaves of bread. I'll give you 2 of my oranges if you give me a pound of your coffee or whatever it is. And the distribution happens through lots and lots of individual bargainings. That's called a market system. It is a way of distributing goods and services when you have a division of labor. It has not been the way we've divided goods and services for most of the history of the human race. We had other ways. Elders did it. Priests did it. Religious rituals accomplished it. The market is relatively new, and the market as a system has always been fought over. It was never instituted as some great acclamation of the best thing to do. Not at all. If you go back, some of you do some reading, if you go back and you study Plato and Aristotle, way back in ancient Greece, there were market arrangements among, if you know the history a little bit, the different Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, and the other ones. They would trade with one another. Trade is another word for market, because trade is, I'll give you 3 of these, you give me 2 of those. And so the question arose, gee, in a society like Athens, where Plato and Aristotle did their work, what will be the impact on our society, which is mostly people producing for themselves and consuming their own stuff? Or if there's specialization, the leaders of Athens, the democratically elected leaders, would divide things up. What will happen if we don't have the old system, but we have this new distribution system, the market? And you may be surprised to learn that Plato and Aristotle, ready? Hated markets, denounced them. And why? Because they destroyed the community. When people are at each other, constantly fighting, I'll give you 3 of these, but I want 6 of those, you just want to give me 5, I'm going to go find somebody else who's going to... This kind of relationship, this kind of haggling at every moment in which we interact with one another such that I want to give you the least possible and get from you the most possible, was a disruptive, asocial human activity that should be banned. So I always love it when people start with a speech about our great forefathers, intellectual giants of the great Western tradition, Aristotle and Plato, and then work seamlessly into a celebration of the status quo. We live in a market society. They hated market societies. And they're not the only ones. It's been disputed ever since. It's been disputed now. I just say that because before you take it that markets have always existed, they haven't. Human beings have done real well, thank you, for a long time without them. And when they came, they were fought over. To imagine that everybody today could or should or would agree with a market system simply not means you don't know much history. Okay, so we have markets. Next step. How is it all organized? Well, we live in a peculiar system that is not only market arranged, but we have a very peculiar way of organizing the production of goods and services that are then traded and distributed by means of a market. How do we do it? Well, let's see. We have work to produce a shirt, a microphone, a briefcase, a camera, anything. It takes lots of different people coordinated, doing various parts of the job to produce a finished good. How do we organize that in our economic systems in the history of the world? Lots of ways. Sometimes people got together, understanding that, look, I can only do a certain amount myself. If I want to do something more complicated than the things I can do myself, I'm going to have to hook up with other people to be able to get that more complicated thing done, like a bridge or a house. Hard to build a house with 1 or 2 people. You need a kind of a bunch, and it takes a lot of time. So how are you going to organize this? How's it going to work? And human beings have done it in a variety of ways, very quickly. One is just you get a group of people together, and you agree amongst yourselves, we're going to work together. Each of us is going to work for 6 months. Each of us is going to work, 5 hours a day, and then we're going to build something, like a barn. And we'll start by building a barn for you, Harry. And when we're done, we'll build a barn for you, Mary. And Mary, you'll help building the house for Harry. And Harry, you'll help building the house for... And so it goes. We work it out. In that arrangement, we work it all out together. We sit around, have meetings. How are we going to build the barn? Who's going to be built first? How's it going? And we work out a plan, and then we all more or less abide by the plan. And if anyone thinks out, we use the usual modes of persuasion that people have developed, everything from a nice conversation to a nasty gossip and whatever else is necessary to get the work done. That's a collective, you might call it, a community way of organizing. Or you might take that other word that comes out of the same root of community and call it, I don't know, communist. That'd be one. It's a community. That's one way. Have people done that in the history of the world? Always. Ancient times, medieval times, and last week. I can tell you all around the United States and elsewhere, that kind of work gets done in that way. Okay? Second, a completely different way. In this second way, some people do all the work, and other people don't. Wow. Let's do that again. Some people do all the work, and other people don't. I'll give you one example. It's a society that organizes people into 2 groups just to get it working like this. One group is called slaves, and the other group is called masters. And there's a lot of ways this comes into being, but we have lots of examples in history of a part of society called the slave and a part of society called the master. The slave is the property of the master, rather like a horse might be, or a chair, or a house. We allow, in those kinds of societies, human beings to be the property of other human beings. And then the master, owning the slave, having dominion over the slave as a property, can treat that slave pretty much as he sees fit. And he says to the slave, I have an idea. You do all the work. You build the house, you make the shirt, you cook the omelet. And you do not only do that so that you yourself can survive, that is, you cook an omelet, you eat, you make a shirt, you wear, that's fine. But you're going to have to do, ready, more than that. You're going to have to do more work than is what taking care of you, because that's what you're going to have to give to me, which will allow me to have an omelet, a shirt, and a chair, and I'm not going to do nothing. You'll do it for me, or else I'm the master. It's a very peculiar arrangement, because it means that right in the production process, instead of us all getting together to work together to produce what we all need, we are introducing a big new difference. Conflict, tension, anger, resentment. Why? Because some people are doing all the work and producing more than they get. A more that we nowadays call the surplus, the extra. What is produced by workers when they produce more than they themselves consume. Slaves produce a surplus that masters get. Masters use it not only to have a lovely lifestyle, but to make sure that this system continues because they like it. But the slaves don't. Not so much. And the reason shouldn't be hard for you to figure out. They're getting, to use a technical term in economics, screwed. Big time. Then there's another system. By the way, slavery systems last a long time. They exist all over the world. They have nothing to do with any particular race. Americans tend to think that slavery has something to do with black people because in America we happen to have that particular arrangement. But slaves have existed in all continents and come in all colors, just like masters have likewise come in all colors. There's no correlation between race and slavery. Never was. There's no need to be parochial about it. Third arrangement, different. Here again, it's interesting. Some people produce a surplus other people get. But the people producing the surplus are not slaves. They're nobody's property. We call this kind of a system with a different name, just to keep it clear in our minds. We call it feudalism. It's sort of what existed in Europe from around 500 AD to around 1500 AD. No more slaves, nobody owns anybody. But a serf is a person who gets born in a particular piece of land and by custom, by religion, by the law, stays there. You're born, most people, as the child of a serf. You are therefore also a serf. And you owe an obligation to the Lord, to some big shot in the area. Those of you who have ever visited Europe, you'll make tourism your activity. You'll be taken to chateaus. That's the French word for, in English, castle, or a German word, Schloss. Like, these are different words, but they're about where the Lord lived, the feudal Lord. And here's how it worked. If you were a serf, you worked 3 days on the land, and the fruit of that work you did was yours to keep. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you went to another piece of land and you worked. That was the land of the Lord. And whatever you produced those second 3 days was his. You went back home. And on the seventh day, you rested. And you know what institution presided over that? The Roman Catholic Church in Europe presided over feudalism. You went to church on the seventh day, and you rested. And then you resumed next week. So the serfs produced in the first 3 days for themselves. In the second 3 days, the surplus that allowed those chateaus to look so grand. You ever been to Versailles outside of Paris? You'll see just how grand it can be if you have hundreds of thousands of serfs working for you, which Louis or whichever one it was, had when he built the chateau at Versailles. Now we come to the next. Just notice, these are different ways in which we have specialization, and we have production organized in different arrangements among human beings. Feudalism was overthrown after 1,000 years. It lasted a long time. Overthrown 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. About when? In Europe. Overthrown. The serfs had it. The problems of the lords, together with the anger and resentment of the serfs, blew the thing up. The most famous moment, the French Revolution of 1789, when the angry masses of the French people grabbed Marie Antoinette out of her castle, her feudal castle, and cut off her head to make a point. And it happened in other parts of Europe as well. And a new system came in. And this new system we now call capitalism. It's the one we still have. It's about 300 or 400 years old. That's all. Which, as systems go, is kind of young. Been around a while. How does it work? Well, it's different from slavery because we don't allow people to own one another. And it's different from serfdom because we don't say if you're born over here to a serf, that's it, you're a serf too. We allow much more, and this is very big, individual liberty and mobility. No matter who you're born to, do what you can. And here's how that system works. Everybody looks for what he or she is going to do. Those of you that are young are in that process now. Where am I going to go to school? What am I going to study? What course am I going to take? Who am I going to study? What credential, what mechanism to find a place in the division of labor? What am I going to do? Some of you worry a lot about it. You even pay people to advise you how to do it. You go to an institution that promises you that if you go there and you do real well and you take the exams and you get the course credit and you get the degree, then you'll get a job. That's not happening anymore, but many of you haven't figured that out yet, and the hope of the system is you never will. But the smarter ones among you have already noticed, and the rest of you will find out soon enough. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. How does this capitalist system work? It's interesting. Here's how it works. The vast mass of people, here we go now, look for a job, which, by the way, they take as axiomatic, as the way life is. Even though, in fact, if you follow what I've said, that's not been the way life is at all. The child of a slave knew exactly what he or she was going to do, didn't need a school, didn't need an advisor, they were going to be a slave too, likely to the same master, or the children of the master. The serf knew where he, she would be, what their lives would be like. No confusion there. No anguished adolescence trying to figure out what I'm going to do with myself. No problem. Capitalism brings you that dilemma because it's kind of open-ended. So you go around looking for a job. Now let's look at that for a minute. When you look for a job, you're actually looking for someone to do something to, with, for, or at you. I'll leave it to you to decide which preposition to use. You look for a boss. You look for someone to do something remarkable with you, to hire you, to engage you, to employ you. A serf never did that. A slave never did that. People who got together collectively did it. Nobody hired anybody else for the vast majority of the history of the human race. That is a very peculiar arrangement. And here's how it goes. You go to an employer, you say, here I am. I just graduated from MIT. Look at how white my teeth are. Please give me a job. I am very good at whatever. And you hope the employer will do that. That's why you went there. You're having an interview. And you have a conversation. And you talk about the work you'll be expected to do, the work you would like to do, all of that bullshit. And then you come to the key moment. How much am I going to get paid? Because you need the money. Why? Because you need to buy a lot of things in order to avoid painful death. food you need. You don't grow that yourself, other than the little pot with the 4 arugula plants. You don't have much, right? So you need food, you need underpants because it's polite, and all the rest of the things you need. And you don't make those yourselves, most of you, so you need money to acquire them. And the job you're going to get is going to give you the money to buy the things that will allow you to survive at least and have a pleasant life, maybe, if you're lucky, at best. So you enter into that key part of the conversation. How much, dear Mr. or Ms. Employer, are you going to give me? And this is a very interesting moment. And let's say you agree on something. Let's say you agree to be paid $20 an hour, or an annual salary that works out to $20 an hour, or 30, or it doesn't make any difference, but let's stay with 20. It's a nice round number. So the employer agrees to pay you $20 an hour. And you must agree in return to do a number of things. That's how this system works. Number one, you agree to come 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. You have to come. You have to be reasonably well dressed. You have to be able to apply your brains and muscle. And you have to be willing to do what you're told to do with whatever the raw materials are there for you to work on and whatever tools and equipment are there for you to work with. And one more thing, really crucial. At the end of the 8 hours, typically, that you've used your brains and muscles in the way you've been told to, on the raw materials you've been given, you will have transformed those raw materials. Remember what I said at the beginning. Something provided by nature, you will have worked up into something else. Whatever the product is that your employer produces, a good or a service, whichever. And here comes the crucial thing. At the end of the day, that your work is embedded, embodied in the finished product that you've been told to produce, you must go home and leave the product of your work there. You made it, but you don't get it. And if you take a little of it home with you, the employer calls those men in blue uniforms and they come to your house and they hurt you to help you understand, no. You make this stuff, then you go home. At home, you drink beer, take off your shoes, go to sleep watching boring television so that you're in shape tomorrow morning to do it all again. Okay? The employer takes the fruits of your labor and the employer decides what to do with it. Now, the most important point of all. The only way, the only time, the only circumstance on which an employer will ever give you $20 an hour, or 30, or 60, or 100, doesn't make any difference. One condition has to be met. During that hour that the employer pays you X worth of money, your labor has to produce for the employer more than X worth of extra stuff for him to sell. Why? Because otherwise there's nothing in it for him. If he pays you $20 an hour, and your hour's worth of work produces another $20 worth of whatever the product of that company is, which he sells for $20, what's he got? He sold for $20, used the money to pay you, he's got squat. And much as he likes you and his fellow man and woman, it's not going to happen. So there's one condition in capitalism under which you will get a job. You will have to produce more for your employer than the employer pays you. So for those of you that have been saying to one another, I'm not going to work for anybody who doesn't pay me what I'm worth, you don't understand this system. That's not going to happen. You're in the wrong country at the wrong time historically. That's more likely for you to be hit by lightning than to discover that situation. You are always going to be ripped off in your job in capitalism because that's the way the system works. But don't worry, there are a lot of people, including lots of economics professors, who will give you one story after another instead of what I just told you, so that you don't get distressed while you're being ripped off, because it might make you resist, which we can't have that. But in capitalism, it turns out we've got exactly the same kind of system as we had in slavery and feudalism. Why? because the worker has to produce more, a surplus, than he gets, which goes to somebody else. It's the employer who sells the hour's worth of output you helped produce for $40 and pays you $20. And what's left over, he gets, just as the master got the surplus the slave produced, or the feudal lord got the surplus that the serf produced. One of the great insights of the most profound thinkers about capitalism is that capitalism wasn't the end of slavery or feudalism, it's a changed form of them. No more slave, no more serf, but surplus being produced by one part of the population, enabling another part to live off of it. That hasn't changed at all. And that means what also hasn't changed is in the heart of the capitalist system is a conflict, a tension, an opposition, a resentment, an anger, and a bitterness between those who are constantly producing more than they get and those who live off that difference. And if you're a capitalist, an employer, what, of course, is your interest? To give the worker the least possible while getting the most out of them, because that's the biggest surplus they can get. And the more surplus they have, the more secure they'll be. It's the same problem the slave master had in relationship to the slave, or the feudal lord in relationship to the serf. So for those of you that have already worked in your lives and wondered why, at the end of many a day, you felt somehow ripped off, it's because you were. And if you tried to find a place where you could shake off this sense of being ripped off, you found one. The neighborhood tavern that offered you at the end of your day a happy hour that you know was there, and given that name precisely because it was in a remarkable way different from all the preceding hours. Wasn't it? So even a society like ours that doesn't want to face or admit any of this, does it despite itself. Can't help itself. Capitalism is a system premised on what Marx called exploitation, which he defined very simply and very carefully. Exploitation exists if and when the people who do the work produce a surplus that other people get and distribute as they see fit. That's why slavery is one kind of exploitation, feudalism is another, and capitalism is a third. What's the alternative? I already told you at the beginning of this little monologue. That's when the people who produce the surplus, the workers, are themselves the people who get the surplus. How would that work? Take any factory, take any office, take any store in America today, here in New York. Change it as follows. No more board of directors. Most things are done by corporations that are run by a board of directors. No more board of directors. Don't need it. Here's how we're going to do it. Monday to Thursday, where all the workers come to work and do what they were always doing. You cook bread, you clear the table, you set the table, you do the dishes, whatever, if it's a restaurant, say. Friday, we have a different arrangement. You come to work, half of you, and you do your regular job, and the other half of you sit around making the decisions. The menu, the investment, the redecorate, all the decisions that used to be made by the capitalist, the boss. The following week, the group of you that had meetings all day Friday last week, you do the work in the restaurant, and the other half of the workers have a meeting instead where they go over these decisions. Workers become their own board of directors. Workers become their own capitalists. Or to say the same thing another way, the worker-capitalist division dissolves. Is that an alternative? Of course it is. Do we have examples of that in history? Loads. Do we have examples of that in the United States today? Loads. Do we understand it as an alternative to capitalism? No, 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 no. No, 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 no. People like me, our economics professors, are very carefully trained to avoid explaining any of this to you. That's what we are. I don't say this for the obvious reasons that you will expect, but I will tell you. I went to Harvard, then I went to Stanford, and my PhD in economics is from Yale. So I'm a poster boy for the education I just described. Major, mediocre. An education designed to give you a very different understanding of how this system works from the one I just gave you. The one I just gave you comes from the work of Karl Marx. Uh-oh. And in my education, we were kept as far away from Karl Marx as you were from certain parts of the town you grew up in where you were supposed to never go, especially not in the evening. And for us, Marx was, I don't know if any of you saw it, I was on that television program last week, Charlie Rose, and he asked me questions about my education at those institutions, and he could not believe, because he didn't want to, that I didn't get much of an education in Marxism, exactly zero in those places, because they were afraid. Marxism tells you this is a system that leaves a lot to be desired and has an awful lot of problems. Whereas we're supposed to believe, aren't we, that we live in an economic system that really is about the best thing since sliced bread, works like a charm, is the best thing the human being could ever come up with, and therefore, shut up. Well, it's one way of organizing an education, but it's not the one that I like. Having said that, let me move into the real topic for today, which is the economic crisis. And here's the connection. Up until 2 or 3 years ago, most of the kinds of talks I would give, because of the pedigree I have, I get invited. Because I've been a professor all my life, I get invited. We call the academic world, people like me, protective coloring. It's like a pheasant that has those feathers. You don't see it quite for what it is. Aha. So, what has happened to change, or why would a person like me be on the Charlie Rose program last Thursday? How did that happen? That happened because the capitalist system that we've had for several hundred years has, in the last 75 years, stumbled badly. The first time was in the 1930s, when it really crashed. We call it the Great Depression. Started in 1929, and we weren't done until 1941. And we weren't really done then, because what finally put people back to work after 11 years of horrible unemployment. Footnote, we are currently in year 5 of the current one. So for those of you that think this will be over soon, maybe, but maybe not. The last one we had like this lasted 11 years, and we never got all the people back to work until the thing that happened right after 1941, which we call World War II, where we took all the remaining unemployed, millions of them in America, we divided them into 2 groups. Half of them got a uniform, and the other half got a job making the uniform. That's what we did. That's what we did. That's how we solved the problem. Okay, I said 2 big stumbles. What's the other one? We're in it. In 2007, a crisis crashed down on capitalism that has made all the glib predictions about how this economic system is an engine of progress, an engine of prosperity, a mechanism for efficiency. All of that looks very poorly now, doesn't it? Well, it should. In 2007, the number of people officially counted unemployed in the United States was about 7.5 million. Today, that number is 15 million. You notice anything? It got worse. Over the last 4 years, several million Americans have been thrown out of their homes by a legal procedure called foreclosure, which means in America today we have a remarkable achievement of capitalism. On the one hand, several millions of people who are homeless, and on the other hand, several million homes that are empty. They stare at each other. There's efficiency for you. Millions of people without work. What do they want? A job. Let's see. Is there machinery, equipment, and raw materials for them to work with and on? The Federal Reserve keeps a number called the capacity utilization rate, the proportion of our industrial capacity that is being used as opposed to the portion that is sitting there gathering rust and dust. What's it currently at? Well, depending on who you listen to, the consensus number, around 79%. So something like 21% of the tools and equipment are sitting there. Okay, let's do this now. Millions of people who want a job don't have one. All the tools, equipment, and raw materials one could ever want for them to work with. And guess what? If we put the people who want a job together with the equipment and the raw materials, they would produce lots and lots of, let's see the word, wealth, which we could use to solve our social problems, rebuild our cities, help the poor, give money to other countries. We could do a lot of wonderful things with the wealth that could be produced by the people who are unemployed but want a job, working with the stuff that's gathering rust and dust. Capitalism is an engine of progress and prosperity. What planet are you on? What did you drink to have such a view? So when a system is as badly performing as this one, and we're now in year 5, the current downturn is dated to have begun in December of 2007. So we're in the 5th year, and there's no end in sight. 2 days ago, the government announced that the rate of economic growth in the last quarter was much lower than they had hoped. It's 1.5% instead of over 2%. And the one thing that means is we're not growing jobs as fast as young people are entering the labor force, which means not only are we not putting the unemployed back to work, we don't even have enough jobs for the new people coming in. This is not a system that's working real well. This is a system that is working real badly. So, in the remaining time I have, I'm going to use the theory that I've described to you a little bit to try to explain to you and answer one overarching question. Why is this crisis so bad? Why is it lasting so long? Why is there no end in sight? Okay, big questions. And before I start, let me just remind you, because I'm a professional economist all my life, I've had to pay attention, this crisis was not supposed to happen. My generation was told that having gone through the Great Depression of the 1930s, we learned the lessons to make sure that nothing like that would ever come back to plague the young people of the future. And so we were okay. It was so repeated, this nonsense, that even the courses that once existed in American universities, as recently as the 1940s and 50s, courses that were mandatory for econ majors, called The History of Crises, The Business Cycle, where students could at least learn to take a look at what had happened, to see what the governments tried when things got bad, what worked, so they'd have some idea. By the 60s, we didn't need those anymore. We didn't have crises. One of the reasons the government is so wonderfully adept at screwing everything up is because they don't know what to do in this situation. It wasn't supposed to happen. When it hit in 2007, the first thing our then president said, George W. Bush, oh, this is a minor crisis in the housing market. It'll be over in 6 months. 6 months later, being the kind of president he was, he said it again. And Obama basically repeats, with variations, the same story. They're using the same advisors, the same economists sitting at the top of the system, a collection of remarkable people we can perhaps discuss a little later. But they don't know what they're doing, and it shows. They have one solution after another. The first stimulus would solve the problem. It didn't. The second stimulus would really do it. Didn't do it either. We're now waiting for the third one, which will come later this year. The Federal Reserve doesn't know what to do. It had brought interest rates down to virtually zero. In a number of countries, in case you don't follow this, the interest rates are negative. You know what that means? That means if you borrow $100 from the bank, you are required at the end of the year to give them 99. Let me do that again. The bank pays you to lend them money. Excuse me, the bank pays you to lend you money. It's remarkable. System isn't working. It's a disaster. And there's no end in sight. And I'm not going to bore you because I hope you understand it. If you have millions and millions of people unemployed, you have staggering social problems. Every index, physical disease, mental disease, school children having problems in school, breakup of romantic relationships and marriages, everything goes like this with rising unemployment. People interrupt their educations, never to go back. The long-term effects of this kind of economic breakdown last for decades. The psychological effects, more. The costs are incalculable of all of this. Try to understand what a child goes through if one or both of the parents lose their job. Even if they don't, they have to be forced out of their house with a sheriff who comes and takes your furniture and puts it out on the street. Where you have to be wrenched out of your set of friends to go to another school in another place. Just do it. Think. We are imposing this on tens of millions of people in this country and abroad. Okay, so why? Why did it happen? Why did it last so long? First part of the story, and I promise you, this is the only time I'll draw anything on the board, and the ideas here are so simple that nothing will be difficult for you to understand. I promise. Okay. We're going to look at the history of the United States, because one of the key reasons why this crisis is so bad is because it is a kind of culmination, as you're going to see in a minute, of the history of the United States. It's not just another one of the business cycles. Oh, by the way, footnote. Capitalism is a highly unstable system. It has business cycles every few years. Between the great crash of the 1930s, 1929 to 1941, and the beginning of the current crisis, 2007, in that interval, 11 other business downturns. I tell a joke in all my classes at the universities where I teach. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out years ago or demanded that your roommate get professional help. But you stay in an economic system that is exactly the same, and you imagine it's your job to adapt. How interesting. You should wonder why you do that and why you think like that. So it's a highly unstable system. But clearly the ups and downs, which on average last a year or two, sometimes have a disastrous kind of downturn, and we're in one of those now. Second major collapse of capitalism globally in 75 years, with 11 in between. If we weren't an ideologically befuddled country, would we have allowed there to be no national debate about capitalism as a system? Given all the other systems I've talked to you about, and there are many more that I didn't. A sane society would have said, whoa, with a performance like this, we ought to at least have a conversation. Could the United States do better than capitalism? Think of it. We're a society that are proud, aren't we? We've debated our education system, made major changes. We allow charter schools. We allow private schools. We have debates over that. We have debates over what curriculum should be. Half the country teaches creationism, and the other half evolution, and all the rest. All the rest. We fight over it. We debate our transportation system. We just spent 2 years debating the medical insurance system of the United States. Should we have a single-payer system? Should we have a government-funded system? Should we have only a private system? You know, you've all been in on it. Came to a head again when the Supreme Court decided to validate the Obamacare bill, et cetera, et cetera. We've discussed most of the systems that make up American society over the last 50 years. By the way, we even debate what is marriage. Geez, would have thought that was kind of sacrosanct. Now we have marriage between people of opposite sex, people of the same sex, under these sort of, we can do it. We can have the debate. But there's one thing there's no debate over. The economic system. It's a complete taboo for 50 years. Republicans and Democrats stumble over each other to be cheerleaders for the system. There's no debate. There's no question. There's no room for people to say, hey, this system stinks. Or, hey, we could do better. How about this? What about this? No, no, no. Capitalism? Wonderful. Isn't it wonderful? Oh, it's Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, they gush. What is this? This is childish. This is a fear-ridden society that is so frightened that no matter how badly this system works, no debate, no conversation. In the 5 years of capitalism's grotesque dysfunction of the last 5 years, no single person, including the few heroes that many of you have, Bernie Sanders, any of them, have been willing to say, the system doesn't work well. The system has to, it's not a question of finding the bad guy and punishing him, the banker who did something nasty, the poor person who borrowed money when he or she couldn't afford a house. Left-wingers have their bad guys, right-wingers have their bad guys, and we want to put them all in jail. What does that do? It simply means that if you take Jamie Dimon at Morgan Stanley and you fire him, his next of, I was about to say kin, his next of bureaucracy will take his place and be subject to the same system with its rewards, its incentives, and its punishments. If you ask people on the hedge fund business, and I know them real well, why they do what they do, their answer is real simple. Because I'll lose my job if I don't do that. And they're right. That's exactly right. And it's true for all of them. They're behaving according to the rules of the system. And when people behave by the rules of the system, and bad result, it ain't the behavior that's the problem. It's the system, which normally people could think about, but not here. Here we have a taboo. We can't. Strange. You ought to wonder about that and how it's shaped your life. Now let's do a history quickly to show why this crisis is so bad. And we're going to start with 1850. We could go back further. The basic story here is that for the first 150 years, roughly, of our country's history, these two lines went up nicely together. The lower line is a measure of the real wage Americans got. How much money you got for an hour's work, a day's work, a week's work, adjusted for the prices you pay. Because it's not interesting that you have so much money unless that can buy you the things you need. So the real wage is a measurement of the money wage you get adjusted for the prices you pay. So if it rises like this from the beginning of our country to around the 1970s, which is what it did, then we have to explain that. That's really interesting. Real wages, what you were able to afford with the wages you were paid, rose steadily in this country for 150 years, at least. That's really interesting for several reasons. One, no other capitalist country was able to do that. Wow. American workers experienced something in American capitalism that workers in capitalisms in England, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, or any place else you pick, didn't. For 150 years. Of course, Americans became, there's a wonderful German word, begeistert. It has no English translation. What? Okay, astounded. It's not quite what I want, but close enough. It's as good as I can do. They became, what? No. That's a different issue. Okay, let me stay with English, my mistake. Wages went up, and Americans became absolutely entranced, there we go, with this phenomenon. Religious Americans believed, clearly, that God obviously preferred us to other people, because look what he was doing. Well, and Americans lived in a charmed place. And this is the greatest country in the world. You know, what every American politician has to say to get elected. We're the greatest country. Obnoxious, right? But we do that because there's partly part of our culture. This is really, and it is exceptional. That's part is right. And Americans got this idea, every generation lives better than the one before. I'm better off than my parents, my kids will be better off than me, and somehow built in. What was going, why? Why did we have 150 years of wages rising? The answer here is really fundamentally very simple. We had in this country a problem. Everything we needed for a successful capitalist growth was here. We got rid of the local people so there were no competitors. We ethnically cleansed the country. Those that were not dead were put in little reservations off in a corner. You know the story, or you should. Fantastically fertile soil, wonderful climate, 2 oceans, lots of harbors, rich with rivers, full of fish and game, and you get wonderful. So capitalists who came here, people who came here and wanted to start a business, were able to do it quickly and easily. Everything was in order with one exception. One thing wasn't here enough of: workers. This country had a perpetual labor shortage. And how did you get people from other parts of the world, particularly those parts from which the capitalists themselves came, Europe, to come here? Well, Americans solved the problem in 2 ways. For the southern half of the United States, the solution was African slavery. You brought the people here by buying them, by collecting them through military means and so on, and bringing them to the South. But for the rest of the country, the North, the Midwest, and remember the rest of the country wasn't settled then, you had to do it by raising wages. To make a foreigner in Europe rip up his life or her life, tear herself away from family, friends, culture, religion, geography, and everything else, to make a dangerous trip across the ocean to an unknown place, you've got to provide a lot of incentive to get people to do that in any numbers. So that was done by selling to the Europeans the idea, in America you could start anew and you could do way better than anything you could hope for in your native country, which for 150 years was true. So that the letters sent back by the immigrants brought more immigrants because they validated this story. It turned out for the employer, not only do I have to raise the wages to bring them from Europe, but no sooner do they come here and they realize they can run off into the interior at any time. There's so much free land that they can become, once again, peasants, which is what most of them had been in Europe anyway. They knew how to do that. So you had to raise wages to bring them, and then you had to keep raising wages to keep them. So wages rose. And it worked for capitalists because the upper line, the line of productivity, how much output each worker produced, that was rising too, because people worked hard here, because immigrants were the kind of people who had the extra to come this distance to work real hard, because they were driven hard by their employers, and because they were paid well. They worked. So it was a nirvana capitalism. Rising productivity, rising wages. A capitalism in which both sides were doing real well. Catching up and eventually overtaking the older capitalisms in England, above all. Wow. Believing you lived in a charmed country, better than anywhere else. Unbelievable opportunity for working people. You know it all because those of you that are Americans have grown up in that. And now you understand the historic roots. Try to imagine with me quickly then, what happens in the 1970s when all of this stops? And it stops in the 1970s because the labor shortage is over and it never comes back. So let's quickly see what happened. First, the computer. The computer, an important modern invention, replaces huge numbers of people. Think of a grocery store. You once needed an army of 50 inventory people to keep track of how many boxes of Rice Krispies moved off the shelf so you would know when to order more replacements. Now, as you all know, it scans by a computer as your Rice Krispie box goes across the scanner, and somebody sitting in Boise, Idaho can tell you how many boxes of Rice Krispies have to be sent to every grocery store in America, and it can tell you that on an hour-by-hour basis. Computers wiped out the need for millions of people. Number two, by the 1970s, American capitalists had an incentive, of course, to use computers. Because wages had been rising for 150 years, they were higher in America than any other capitalist had. And by the 1970s, the peculiar position of the United States after World War II, when we were the only capitalist country that was left, everything else had been destroyed by the war, that was over. The Japanese and the Germans led the recovery of our competitors. By the 1970s, they were competing. By the 1970s, Americans were getting used to learning new names for cars. Instead of Ford, Chevy, and Chrysler, they learned Toyota, Datsun, and all the rest. So Americans were worried. We're at a disadvantage because our workers get paid too much. Ha-ha! A computer. I get rid of the worker. Who needs the worker? I buy one computer, I can fire 50 high-priced workers. Second thing capitalists did, beside instituting computers, is to move production out of the United States. Big time. Where? To where workers hadn't had this experience, which is where? Everywhere else in the world. To take advantage of cheap labor. Why did they do that? That goes back to what I told you. Because the capitalist gets more surplus, the less he has to pay the workers for the work they do. So of course you move from here and reopen the factory in Shanghai. Of course, Starbucks is opening more new coffee shops in China than it is in the United States now. Of course. You know what you have to pay a coffee producer and a barista in Shanghai? More or less nothing. I mean, it's more than nothing. They have to live, but not much more. And by American standards, fantastic. So, two other things happen. Not only are jobs disappearing because the computer and export of jobs is happening, but suddenly more Americans, or people in America, are looking for work. First and most important, adult, white women move into the paid labor force by the millions starting in the 1970s. Whether you call that women's liberation or you call that a changing culture or whatever you call it, there's a movement of a whole new part of our population who used to define themselves as mothers, homemakers, and wives and all of that, and they want a job now. They want a job out there in the world, just like the men do. So they're coming in huge numbers. And finally, we have yet another wave of immigration for a whole host of reasons, but not from Europe this time, mostly from Latin America. Coming in, looking for work, women looking for work at a time when the computer and export of jobs, the labor shortage is over. The supply of workers now exceeds the demand. And what does every capitalist do, whether or not he's ever gone to a business school? He realizes, I don't have to raise wages anymore, ever. I got loads of people who want a job and can't find one. If any of my workers complain that I've stopped raising wages, I say to them, have a nice day. There's 400 people out there who would take your job tomorrow. So be real quiet, and I won't slam the door on you. And you know something? Most employers don't have to tell that to workers. They already figured it out. Notice this line? That's the line of real wages in the United States. They stopped rising in the 1970s, and they never resumed again. Oh my God. An American people who believe they're in a promised land, a land cherished by God, where it's their birthright to do better, to have a higher standard of living, to promise their children the American dream, can't do it because the wages to pay for it aren't there. American workers do two things. By the way, why? Because what I'm showing you, these graphs, was never discussed in the United States. No national conversation. Wasn't begun by the president at the time, by the Congress, by the leading opinion makers, by the universities. Nothing. So this horrible change in our situation was experienced by the American people the way they experience most social changes, as if it were an individual problem. Your wages aren't going up, you're a dummy. You didn't take the right courses. You don't have the right degrees. You don't work hard enough. You drink too much pot, whatever. And Americans felt bad. They blamed themselves. We are the leading country on earth to do that, and we blamed ourselves. So what did Americans do? They responded to the end of rising wages by making more people go out and work. Another reason for the adult women to get out there, because if the family was going to have the American dream, it now needed 2 people working full-time, not just 1. Old people came out of retirement. Teenagers learned the joys of a Saturday job, etc. Today, Americans do, according to the OECD, a major research association, Americans do more hours of paid labor per year, on average, than any other working class in any country on this planet. We work ourselves to death. And that's a reaction to this. But that didn't solve the problem. It didn't make enough extra money. Because in our strange society, when women go out to work, it turns out that the family has a whole bunch of new expenses. The mother who stayed home made all the food. When she works a regular job, she can't do that. So now we buy, you know, fast food. It's expensive. It's expensive. And mother has to have a transportation. We don't have a public transportation system in this country, in 90% of our country, so it meant a second car. She has to have another set of clothes to go out and work in the office. You put it all together, the net income left after her income with all the extra expenses can't solve the problem. So the American working class becomes a new pioneer. Not anymore crossing the continental United States. We did that a century earlier. The working class of America becomes the first working class in modern history to borrow a quantity of money for its regular daily life that no other working class had ever imagined, let alone undertaken. You in this room are used to going into a bodega in New York City when it's hot and you want a bottle of water and handing someone a credit card. That means you're borrowing the money for the bottle of water. That's a level of credit use and debt that's unheard of in the history of the human race. Americans went into debt. They borrowed. They kept borrowing. Okay, you don't need a PhD in economics. You really don't. Take it from someone who has one. You don't need it. But if you keep borrowing and your wages are flat, pretty soon you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Because the wage is what you have to pay back the debts you're accumulating. And if the wage is going nowhere and your debts are going up, then say by, I don't know, 2007, you're busted. You're done. The American working class in 2007 is dead. It can't. It hasn't got the wages, and it can't borrow any more money because it can't pay back the money it already borrowed. It can't. That's why the crisis lingers, because the mass purchasing power of the United States is exhausted by a history of the whole country, not just by the last couple of years. Now, quickly, let's look at it from the capitalist point of view. How have the years since the 1970s been for them? Spectacular. Unbelievably good. Best time ever in the history of American capitalism. Why? Real simple. The upper line, productivity. Workers became more productive over the last 30 years, just as they had become more productive in the earlier years. Why? A worker with a computer can do more things in an hour than a worker without one. Not a tough one. Workers' education was getting better. Workers' discipline was getting better. Capitalists were driving their workers harder. For all those reasons, productivity. And what is productivity? The amount of goods and services a worker can deliver to the boss per hour of his or her work. Your productivity, how much stuff you can produce. Okay, again, remember, I promised you don't need a PhD. If for the last 35 years, the wages were flat, what is the wage? It's what the boss gives you for coming to work. Flat. What productivity is what you give the boss when you work. It goes up. Okay, come on. You can see where we're going, right? The surplus, what you produce over and above what you get out of what you produce, That's the difference between these two lines. That's what the surplus is. That's what these lines measure. So the surplus goes nuts in the last 35 years. We have the greatest peacetime stock market boom we've ever had in our country. Of course, the stock market is the people who get pieces of this surplus. That's what they do when they buy and sell stocks. What do the capitalists do? They can't get over it. It's like they were born at the exact right moment. Or not born, but arrived at being the head of Dipsy Doodle Corporation. And this is as true on Wall Street as it is on Main Street. A distinction that only in the American imaginary could figure as important. Every capitalist took advantage of this. I don't have to pay my workers anymore because we don't have a labor shortage anymore. But I can get out of them as much as another computer and another pressure can generate. They all did that. The little ones with 6 workers, all of whom they know by their first name, and the big corporation with 10,000 employees. They all did it the same. They're all equally coupable, as the French would say. Guilty, guilty. Okay, so they're sitting on a mountain of money getting bigger. What do they do with it? They have to speed up a little now, quickly. But I can see I have your attention, so I'll play with it. Number one, the capitalists looked at this situation and they were smart. They did not make the analysis I'm presenting to you. Because that would make them what? The leeches who cashed in on a social situation that made wages stop rising. They wouldn't like to think of themselves as leeches. Most people don't. So they came up with a different story. Ready? Here it was. The reason corporations are making all this mountain of money is because they're led by entrepreneurial geniuses. No. I mean this real seriously. Those of you that are a little bit older, you remember names like Lee Iacocca or Jack Welch. Iacocca was the head of Chrysler or Ford or one of them. Jack Welch was the head of GE. We began to have, in the 1970s and 80s, all these books about these fantastic corporate executives who were making all this money. They were telling a story that they did something. I always thought that was wonderful, because if it was their genius that was making money then, it must have been their stupidity that was preventing it back there. But that was an implication they didn't worry about. There was method to their madness, and madness it was. Because, of course, if the reason the company is making a ton of money is the great leadership of the top executive, rather than the end of a labor shortage, then it would be reasonable for the top executive to say, pay me, because I'm the one who's making all the money. In the 1970s, the average of what a CEO got in relationship to the average wage of a worker was 43 to 1. Last year, it was over 400 to 1. You understand the difference? You understand the difference? So the first thing that this mountain of surplus was used for was to create a whole new class of super rich people who either were top executives or had shares in the companies and were given big dividends and so forth as this situation exploded. They're the people that live in the right neighborhoods, that have the co-ops in Tribeca, the houses in the Hamptons, and so on, okay? Second thing that was done with the surplus: expand the movement of jobs out of the country. For an American corporation to close a factory in Schenectady or to close an office in the Bronx and move to China is very scary too. It's kind of the reverse scare of an immigrant coming here. It's dangerous, it's risky, you don't quite know. It's something you hesitate to do unless you're flush with money. A good part of this money was used to keep the whole system going by moving production out of the country because they could afford it now. They had the money to take those risks. And that's when you see the acceleration of moving businesses to India, China, and all the rest. Third, money was used by these wealthy people, top CEOs, and the people becoming very rich because they were the top CEOs. They understood something which wealthy people have always understood. If your society especially one like ours that celebrated that we're all in the middle class and everybody's more or less equal, if you suddenly wrench this society into a polarizing rich and poor, the way we have done for 30 years, which is why Occupy Wall Street did that 1%, 99% slogan. If you do that, the 1% understand the ultimate problem capitalism has always had, just like feudalism and slavery had it too. If a tiny number of people have a ton of stuff, and a vast number of people don't, you're going to have trouble. And especially in a society where the political system, at least on paper, says everybody gets a vote, which we do. So then rich people understand we're screwing the hell out of them really well, the mass of people in the economy. But they may decide to use the political system to undo the screwing they're getting in the economic system. They might use their control of politics, they have the votes, to get the taxes changed, to get the government spending changed, to get everything changed, to get back politically what they lost on the job. So the only way the wealthy can protect themselves is they've got to control the politics. And over the last 30 years, that's what they did. They bought it, because that's what they had, money. And they went in and they bought the parties and they bought the politics. You know all that, you don't need me for that. Meanwhile, the mass of people, because, remember what I told you about how they reacted to this situation? They sent more people out to work. They borrowed more money. The average American family is freaked out. It's working too many hours. It's got no time to do anything. It's worried sick about its debts. The emotional life of the family, which used to be held together by the mother, can't be because she's as exhausted from her work as the father is. And he never learned how to do it anyway. Well, it's a very serious problem. The family is falling apart. 30 years ago, the standard comedic program on an evening TV was a wonderfully intact family. Remember Ricky Nelson and the other family? The father goes out to work, the mother waits for him with a big smile when he comes home with a briefcase, and they all have dinner together with the dog. Today, we turn on the television, what do we see? A couple who can't stand each other, who haven't had sex in so long they forgot what it's like. They don't know their children. And we laugh with the recognition of the dissolution of the family. Hello. This is a family who is so freaked out, so worked up, so anxiety-ridden, they don't go to political meetings anymore. And since they don't participate, they don't pay any attention. So, of course, over the last 30 years, the mass of the American people, the working class, withdraws from politics. We haven't become right-wing. It's that the support for the left wing that comes out of the 1930s, the New Deal, the Democrat, that stopped being political, and in came the people with the money who replaced them. And of course, we therefore have what we have. A system corrupted by what? By the same basic capitalist way of handling this situation. Nothing has changed. Now to answer my questions in the remaining 5 minutes. Have wages started to go up? Not at all. Has productivity stopped rising? Not at all. That's why the profits reported by business remain robust. Of course they do. In fact, wages are tending down now because of the competition of all the unemployed who need work and will work for less and less. There's a strike going on now in the Caterpillar company in Peoria, Illinois. 800 highly paid, technically adept factory workers. The demands of Caterpillar: 6-year no wage increase commitment, 6-year no pension increase. Over those 6 years, prices are rising currently 2 to 3% a year. Do the arithmetic. If you don't get any increase in your pension, you don't get any increase. You're taking a loss in what you can actually afford. That's what's offered by them. And when the union said no, strike. They don't care. They're moving production out of the country anyway. Corporations have no incentive to change this. Why should they? When it is said to them, you know, Americans who are unemployed, Americans whose wages are not going up, will not be able to buy things, they say, of course they won't. They use the following language from economics. The United States is a mature economy. As anybody over 40 knows, the minute you hear that word mature, you're in trouble. It is a polite word for an unpleasant thought. The United States as a mature economy means it's not an economy that's growing anymore. It's an economy that's shrinking in the way that matters to capitalists. They won't buy. So if you're a company that needs to grow, to survive, to compete, your growth is going to be somewhere else. Which means we're now entering a new phase of American history. After 35 years in which first manufacturing was moved out of the United States, and now white-collar work is moved out of the United States, we now have the final step. Corporations see their market as elsewhere in the world. So they're not going to spend a lot of advertising dollars in Michigan. They're going to spend it in Mumbai. They're not going to open an office to look for new contacts of new business in Peoria. They're going to open it in Eastern Europe or Latin America. That's where growth is happening. Brazil, Russia, China, India. Not here. So those of you who think that corporations will save us because Americans have to have the money to buy, no, they don't. They're looking for other people. So with a political system dominated by them, and they see no need to change, no change is going to come from the top. Last point. What happened in the 1930s? In the 1930s, it was different. The Depression was very bad, worse than it is now. Unemployment in 1933 was 25%. Today it's 8.5%, 3 times worse. Numbers are not exactly comparable, but you get the idea. So the situation then was worse than it was today. There's no money. Every city and state, like today, we don't have the money. We have to cut back the services. We have to lay off people. We have to. Companies not hiring. Terrible. In the midst of that impossibility, the way today Obama and, what's his name? Romney, are discussing what cuts have to be done. And the Democrats pose as those who will cut us less. The Republicans will cut us more. In the middle of that, something happens in the 1930s that ought to make you sit up and take notice. Roosevelt, in 1933 and 4, begins to do what would now appear to be bizarre things. He gets on the radio and he says, I'm going to create the Social Security system. We never had that before. I'm going to give every American 65 years of age or older, in the depths of the Depression, money every month for as long as you live. Here, have a nice day. Wow. Where was the money going to come from? But before anyone could even answer the question, he goes on the radio the next day and he says, I'm going to create for the first time an unemployment compensation system. If you lose your job for no fault of your own, we didn't have that before, just like we never had a Social Security system before that, the government will give you for a year or two a weekly wage for not working. Whoa, you can see why the American anthem would become popular. Wow. There were tens of millions of people unemployed. We're talking big bucks. And then the third day he went on the radio and said, yeah, the 2 things I'm spending money on I already told you about, it's nothing. Wait till you hear this. He created and filled 12.5 million federal jobs working for the federal government. Social Security for old people, unemployment compensation for the unemployed, and jobs. Where did the mountain of money come from? Answer. Roosevelt went to the corporations and the rich, and he said to them, fellas, remember he comes from that were his friends, his neighbors, his relatives. He says, I got really bad news. You see all those people marching in Union Square in New York, carrying banners? Those are people from the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, the greatest union drive in American history. In the midst of the Depression, the CIO unionized millions of workers who had never been in a union before. And he did that with the help of the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Communist Party, all of which were powerful in the United States at that time. And they were in the news every day. They were marching everywhere. And he went to the rich and the corporation and said, well, you got 2 alternatives, gentlemen. One, you give me a shitload of money so that I can take care of these miserable people suffering through the Depression. I got to give them something big. Because if you don't, coming down the road behind me are the CIO, the socialists, and the communists, and they're going to cut you a lot worse deal than I'm offering. Half of the rich and the corporations understood what he said and went with him. The other half didn't buy it. The other half are what then rebuilt the Republican Party after the war to make sure that never happened again. But the half that went with Roosevelt allowed him to go back to the AFL-CIO, well, it was then just the CIO, and the socialists and the communists, and he said, look, I'm going to get you something for the mass of the suffering people who are creating your movement. I'm going to give them Social Security, I'm going to give them unemployment insurance, and I'm going to give them a job. I'm going to give them what you're demanding, but you got to forget that crap about going beyond capitalism. You got to drop that stuff, because then I can't get them. That deal was made. That deal was agreed to by all of them. Some with more grief about it, some with more hesitation, but they all bought it. That deal was done. They paid the money in taxes, highest taxes corporations and rich people ever paid in America in those years. It's been cutting those taxes ever since. Okay? Top income tax bracket in 1943, the middle of the war, 94%. Rich people, every dollar they got over about $60,000, they had to give 94 cents to Uncle Sam. They got to keep 6. The same rate today, 35 cents they give to Uncle Sam. The other 65 they keep to themselves. In 1944, Roosevelt went to the Congress and presented a bill that would create a maximum income in the United States. Nobody could earn more than what the equivalent is today. Was $25,000 then. The equivalent today would be $350,000. For every nickel that any American earned above $350,000, the tax would be, ready? 100%. You don't get it. That was proposed by the President of the United States. And when the Congress went ballistic because of the business interests, the deal, the compromise, was that 94%. So he got the money out of the rich. And he created that. And that meant that the Great Depression wasn't as horrible on American people, even though it was a worse depression than the current crisis is, which isn't so bad a depression, but there's no cushion. There's no help. There's nothing. Why? Why? Why is it so bad? That's the question I promised to answer. The final answer, besides all the analysis, is that there was a movement then. Roosevelt had to go to the rich because below was coming something very scary, not only demanding all these benefits, but threatening social change, economic criticism. They were making the concrete demand to debate and change the economic system. And they were so scared, the people at the top, they gave them all of that. By the way, was the politician who made this happen Roosevelt? Taking a great risk, the way Obama has his people tell Occupy Wall Street, I can't do these things. I'm with you, but I can't do these things. It's too difficult. Roosevelt did these things. And what was his reward? The most popular president in the history of the United States. He was reelected 4 times. No president had ever been reelected 4 times. The Republicans were so freaked out by it that after he died, they got the law passed that gives every president only a maximum of 2 terms. This wasn't a political chance Roosevelt took. It's what made him the most popular president in the history of the country. It was the movement from below that observed no taboo that made the difference. And final irony, and if you understand this, you understand a lot of what Hegel tried to teach us about social development. When the war was over, when the Depression had been overcome by the war, that half of the business and rich community that had never bought the threat from below, that were prepared to fight, didn't go with Roosevelt. They made sure to undo as their #1 priority the movement that had gotten Roosevelt to provide for people in the depths of the Depression. They went to destroy the labor movement, they went to destroy the socialist parties, and they went to destroy the Communist Party. And they have succeeded. Over the last 50 years, the labor movement has declined in its strength every single year. It's a line that looks like that. The AFL-CIO today represents less than 7% of private sector employees in the United States. It's done. You can't do anything. The socialist and communist parties are virtual. I mean, they exist, but their political influence is nothing compared to what it once was. They went after them. They destroyed them. And now the irony. A big historical question. Could capitalism have survived an 11-year depression in the 1930s had the leader not provided for people Social Security, unemployment compensation, and jobs? Would things have polarized, and then what? The argument that was always made was that the movement from below saved capitalism from its own excesses. If that's true, then you must wonder whether the system has now destroyed the only chance it has to avoid the cataclysm it avoided last time, because it destroyed the left that might have made this society handle this crisis in a different way. Europe is moving ever closer to the edge of a cliff. The United States is literally talking about a fiscal cliff at the end of this year, if you pay attention to these things. We have a capitalism that is spinning out of control. It produced a depression and a collapse that was not expected. It has shown itself unable for 5 years to handle it, to overcome it, to fix it. And it is now pushing ahead as if it doesn't have to deal with this problem. It can just go on. Occupy Wall Street is the first sign, the same mechanisms are reviving again. Nobody knows how that'll develop or where it'll go. But it's a very peculiar capitalism that produces these kinds of catastrophes and develops a politics that makes it uniquely incapable of handling its own problems. The only bad news in all of this is that you and I are living and have to live through this. And the only way to change it is if another movement from below can be created, either to reproduce what happened in the 30s, at least a softer, gentler depression, or the alternative that was avoided in the 30s, which is a final coming to terms with whether capitalism is indeed the best this country can do. But lest you think I'm ending on a pessimistic note, which I'm not, I can assure you that speaking across the country as I do, doing the media work that I do, more interest is in the kinds of analysis I've just tried to present to you in the last 2 years than in the previous 40. Whatever you hear and read about the Tea Party, something very big is changing in the United States below the surface, where the interest in, the openness to, the literal hunger for analytic explanations of the sort I've just given you is greater than anything. And I was active in the 1960s. This is, from that point of view, a much better situation than we had then. Much more interest, much more response. Thank you very much for your attention.